Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. We have a special episode today because there's a new book coming out, and it is called No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson. And I have been reading through this book, and I feel like for anybody, it's shocking. I think for someone who is a mom, someone who took birth control for years of my life, someone who's a cancer survivor and has reconstructive surgery and breast implants, like all of this is somewhat terrifying to me. And then I look at like what the future could be with dementia and all of the things that happen in your body. And this is all covered in this book in such a shocking way from a brand that we have put on the side of the bathtub from the time we were tiny little babies until, the nursing home. And I have Gardiner Harris here today to talk to me about it. He is the author of the book, and he previously served as the public health and pharmaceutical reporter for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Now he's a freelance investigative journalist. I read that you took 5 years to do this book.
I did. Yeah, it took me a long time. I've made some mistakes along the way. It wasn't just, but yeah, mostly because there are, thousands of documents that I had to go through, hundreds of thousands of pages, and I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people.
And that's why I bring up that it was 5 years, because you can tell. I mean, when you read through this, it's so well documented. And I think that is the stunning part about it. It was obviously a passion project for you to get to the truth, to find out what was really going on and truly expose it. And the timing of this book with RFK Jr. at the helm of Health and Human Services it must be inspiring for you, I would assume, to see that?
Sure. I mean, I think he is certainly someone for whom a lot of the themes in this book will resonate, I think. I mean, Tudor, it's interesting. I mean, you are the perfect person to talk to this about, because the point of this book really is to go through. Johnson & Johnson is the most important healthcare product company in the world. And going through its history is really a roadmap for people like you to really protect yourself and your family. I want people to sort of see in each part of the healthcare system what can happen, how it can go wrong. And as you walk through this, hopefully you can figure out the people you can trust and the people you can't trust. And, one of the things I'm doing, Tudor, is I'm putting all of these documents on my webpage so that you can do your own research. This is all primary stuff. You can read all the trial transcripts. You can walk through all of the internal documents yourself. The one set of documents that I'm not putting on there are the grand jury files that I have. Those are secrets. It's illegal for me to have them. It was illegal for people to give them to me. I don't want to provide any clues to investigators to find my sources, but everything else is online and you can do this work yourself.
So let's dig in, because at the end of the book, you say something about Johnson & Johnson. You compared Johnson & Johnson to the mafia, but you say that it's worse because they preyed on the most vulnerable. And I want to be careful. I feel like I have to be so careful with this conversation, because I don't want there to be a mass hysteria of people who say, I will never trust a company ever again, because there are life-saving medications that come out of this company.
Sure.
and great products. But should they not be held accountable for the countless deaths that they've also caused? I mean, it's such a double-edged sword to talk about this subject, because it's shocking. I mean, even from the start of the Tylenol disaster, it's like I grew up in the Chicago area. So I was reading about that, and I can remember this discussion happening, and this was such a tragedy. And they were lauded as like, oh, this great company that came in and saved it. But then you read that they had so many warnings that this was going to happen and they could have stopped it, but they didn't because of cost. Well, because of profit.
Tudor. I mean, one of the things that everyone who goes to Harvard Business School, everyone who goes to the Wharton School, in the first month at those schools, you get this case study of how Johnson & Johnson handled the 1982 Tylenol poisoning scare. And it is widely considered by far the best corporate response to a crisis ever. And that's what business school students are always taught. That's what communication school students are always taught. And what I wanted to do is go through that story again and show that that's not actually true, that the company did a lot of things that are not particularly ethical. I mean, one of them, of course, is that they almost certainly were paying the FDA commissioner at the time. You know, every FDA commissioner in modern history has gone to work for pharmaceutical manufacturers after they left office. Many worked for them beforehand. Arthur Hayes Jr., the commissioner at the time, is the only one who was taking money, as far as we know, from Johnson & Johnson and other pharmaceutical companies at the time he was commissioner. Let me take that back. We don't actually know that it was Johnson & Johnson, but we know that he was taking money from Johnson & Johnson afterward, and we know that he was taking money from some unnamed pharmaceutical company while he was commissioner. It never actually came out which, but it's hard not to speculate that it was likely Johnson & Johnson. You know, look, Tudor, I want to urge people to get this book while they can, because, you know, Johnson & Johnson is basically a law firm with a drug and a device company attached. They have spent $35 billion since 2011 on legal services. They basically have every major corporate law firm working for them. They sue everyone. And so, this project was always a little bit of a suicide project. Everyone I talked to about it, many of them my old friends, were like, Gardiner, you're crazy. Like, do you know what kind of lawyers these people have? Why are you doing this? And
no, that's what I thought. I'm like, how is he going to get away with putting this out? I mean, that's how much I know about how dangerous these companies are. And I think innately we all kind of know that, because I'm reading this and I'm like, this guy is going to end up suicided. Like, how is he so brave to do this?
So it's a miracle that this got through Random House's lawyers. It took weeks. A huge amount of the book ended up falling out. But to be clear, Random House's British subsidiary will not publish this book. We're still in discussions with the Indian one, but this is not being published almost anywhere else because of the legal risks.
Wow. I can completely understand why. I mean, you just talked about the bribing of the FDA commissioner, but it's really, you go into detail about the bribing of America's doctors. And it's funny because when I first got into the corporate world, I was working in manufacturing, but so many of my friends were selling drugs for pharmaceutical companies. It sounds bad, but they were the salespeople for big pharma. And that was exactly how it was. Every day they were going from one place to another with a big thing of Panera or, whatever the big food item was of the day. They would provide a massive lunch. You would go to the doctor's offices and they had a huge spread of food. All the nurses were taking food. They were giving out free drugs. And you would go to the doctor and they say, oh, well, I have a free sample. You try it. And then come back to me and tell me how it is. I remember this so clearly. And these kids, I was working in manufacturing and, we're probably a normal couple trying to figure out life. And my friends who were working at Big Pharma, they were getting fancy cars. They were just a local salesperson in Western Michigan, and they were bringing in bank.
It's a hugely profitable way of going. As I point out in the book, basically nothing the pharmaceutical industry did was more remunerative, more profitable than giving money and food to doctors. every penny that they spent on doctors, they got back fourfold in drug sales. And of course, it led doctors. Every study that's been done on this practice has shown that it makes doctors worse at their jobs, and it's going on today, Tudor. I mean, there is the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which passed because of my stories back in the day, shows that pharmaceutical companies to this day are giving doctors $2.3 billion annually, mostly in cash. And these are quasi-consulting relationships, but basically they are hidden ways of just paying doctors for their prescriptions. And, I walked through case after case. This is how the opioid crisis took off, of course, Tudor, as you know. It's how we can talk about the antipsychotic crisis, which is twice as bad as the opioid crisis and is going on right now. We can talk about the EPO crisis in cancer, close to your heart, which is about the size of the opioid crisis in terms of the number of people who were killed. And in case after case after case after case, it's doctors taking money and prescribing drugs in dangerous ways as a result. But it's not just doctors, Tudor. Of course, as we go through the baby powder stuff, you will see that countless top-notch corporate lawyers are knowingly lying in federal court about trying to hide the fact that asbestos has been found in baby powder for as long as it's been made. And,
causing cancer.
Causing cancer, causing countless women, probably more than 100,000 women to die of ovarian cancer is the best epidemiological estimate.
It's just shocking to me. I mean, as I'm reading through this, I read through all of the facts that they're doing all of these trials, and you think about all the drugs that the FDA does not approve, and they're going through all these trials, and the trials are proving that the product is bad, and yet they have lobbyists, and like you said, they've got law firms. They own Washington. They own the FDA. Essentially, they can get things through no matter what. And that I was reading about the mesh that they use in the hernias that you have in there, that they said, okay, women have these prolapsed bladders. They're going to use this mesh and these are just facts, folks. I know this is a hard discussion to have. People don't want to hear about it. I've had 4 kids. Things change inside your body, And they went to women and they said, oh, we've got a better way of lifting up your bladder so that you don't have this prolapsed bladder. Your insides are going to be much better. They use this mesh. And I think it's just shocking when you read about this, and it makes me get emotional because I was like, they knew this was happening to women. The most shocking part is that the women are getting sick. They have infections. They know that they're getting infections, but then
hundreds of thousands of women around the world, Tudor, hundreds and hundreds of thousands.
And Johnson & Johnson knows, and they do nothing about it. According to your book, they go,
well,
you know what?
Not only did they know, they knew before they started selling this. They had research that showed that for about a third of women, it was going to make it impossible for them to have vaginal sex again in their lives. It was essentially going to rip their vaginal walls for the rest of their lives so that they would leak blood. You'd never be able to wear a skirt. You would always have to have pads. And they knew this before they started selling it. And in fact, as I walk through in the book, vaginal mesh is the next to last product I talk about. COVID-19 is, of course, the last one. But what Johnson & Johnson does is first they lie to FDA, and then with vaginal mesh, they don't even bother to lie. They don't even ask FDA for permission to sell it. They just start selling it. And FDA doesn't really find out what's going on for years. But what I show in the book is that FDA does basically nothing each time it catches Johnson and Johnson in one of these, criminal situations. And that's because Johnson and Johnson, another story I tell, saved FDA in 2012, got FDA the money it needed through Congress, and FDA paid Johnson and Johnson back again and again and again and again by not going after it when the company clearly was doing wrong things, and by, in fact, putting out statements just before Johnson and Johnson was going to trial and someone was going to take them to account, and FDA would put out a statement in support of Johnson and Johnson, just sort of out of the blue. It did this in baby powder. It did this with Risperdal. It did this with opioids. One of the things that I talk about in the book, of course, everybody knows about the opioid crisis. Everyone knows that Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers were to blame. Well, that's just not true. And you have to ask yourself why you think that. Of the bodies that showed up in morgues during the prescription opioid crisis, we're now in the fentanyl crisis. By the way, fentanyl is a Johnson and Johnson drug. But we're now in the original prescription crisis. About 10% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. 60% had a J&J product in their system. No one knows this. Why don't you know it? It's because this company is everywhere in the health system, in the political system, and in media. I worked at the New York Times. I worked at the Wall Street Journal. As you know, Tudor, I take both of those publications to task for failing again and again and again to tell this story.
We've got more coming up with Gardiner Harris, but first I want to tell you a little bit about my partners at American Alternative. I know you guys are seeing the stock market going up and down, and that can be scary, but that's why you need to think about the stability of gold. I'm excited about my newest sponsor, American Alternative Assets. They take a different approach to precious metals. American Alternative Assets gets to know you, gets to know your family and your needs to make sure that precious metals are the right choice for you. You should just call and find out if it's a good fit, because they only work with people that they know they can help. And then once you're a client, they provide quarterly check-ins to ensure your strategy is on the right track. And here's the best part. American Alternative Assets is offering our listeners a free wealth protection guide and up to $10,000 in free silver with a qualified purchase. So call right away. It's 877-522-GOLD or visit tudorsgold.com right now to claim your free wealth protection guide. Don't wait until it's too late. Protect your wealth and secure your future today. That's 877-522-GOLD or visit tudorsgold.com. Now stick around. We've got more after this. You're talking about death and destroyed lives. And obviously death is destroying everybody's life around that person too. But even the products like the vaginal mesh that you were just talking about, when you say these women can never have sex again, I think the most striking comment was the woman you interviewed who said, I never thought that this would be the end of my life at 71 years old and the end of my marriage. And
Right.
That was so sad to me because the husband described this as making love to a wire brush. This
Right.
is what this company did to people, and they get
Right.
away with it. And this was like 20 years. That's the shocking thing to me, is like this started in the late 90s and the FDA doesn't really say we're done until 2019.
Right.
How?
Right. And that's right. And look, other countries pulled vaginal mesh like the Australians. It's an interesting thing that vaginal mesh in Australia was an enormous scandal, a huge controversy that the Prime Minister addressed, that the Senate in Australia launched an investigation of. They actually created clinics just for women who had had vaginal mesh inserted, and they forced Johnson and Johnson to take this product off the market 7 years before the FDA did. So, and they both knew all the same information. Why was the FDA so much slower?
But also, I mean, doesn't that, you just said you've taken your old media outlets to task for stuff like this, but this does sound like something that you think happens in China or Russia, where the people are so insulated that they don't actually get to hear the truth because the state media can control whether or not the people know what's actually happening to them medically. It seems impossible that with a free press that this could happen in the United States of America, and that no one's saying, man, these women are suffering horrendously. There's never a documentary. There's nothing exposing it. I mean, it's just totally shocking. And as I'm reading about these other medications, the Risperdal, is that how you say it?
Right. Yep.
That one also, I mean, the link of that, finding out that this is not good for elderly patients. They're using it for dementia. They're using it for Alzheimer's. They know it's not good. It also is making these patients more susceptible to respiratory illness. COVID hits. Patients are taking this drug. Johnson & Johnson knows the combination is the most deadly combination they can have. No one says anything. Where's the media?
Right. And to this day, no one has, look, the United States suffered terrible death in its nursing homes, much worse than any other country. The United States also uses Risperdal and other antipsychotics in nursing home patients much more than any other country. These drugs, one of the great reasons they kill you is by making, as you said, you more susceptible to respiratory infection. COVID-19 is a respiratory infection. Why did all these people get wiped out in nursing homes? Well, was it because so many of them were being inappropriately given Risperdal and these other drugs? As I have the grand jury files on the Risperdal investigation, right? And what I go through is that Johnson & Johnson basically told psychiatrists and other doctors, don't worry, you can continue to give Risperdal to your patients, even if you kill them, and no one will know. No one will be able to catch you because you die from Risperdal the same way you die other ways, like you get heart attacks and strokes and you get infections. And no one will be able to distinguish between those who died because of Risperdal and those who just died naturally. But then they said, according to these grand jury files, to cover your tracks, start diagnosing your dementia patients as having late onset schizophrenia, right? There is no such thing as late onset schizophrenia, like nowhere. But psychiatrists across the country start diagnosing their dementia and Alzheimer's patients as having schizophrenia. Right now, Tudor, at this moment, 1 in 9 nursing home patients in the United States is diagnosed with schizophrenia. Okay.
Grief.
Nearly all of those diagnoses are false. No more than 1% of the entire population is schizophrenic, and nearly all schizophrenics die in their 50s. Schizophrenia itself costs you about 30 years of life expectancy. So there are almost no genuine schizophrenics in nursing homes, and yet nearly 15% of nursing home patients right now are diagnosed with schizophrenia. As a top person from the FDA told me off the record, this is mass euthanasia with plausible deniability.
And the drug is not even doing what they say it's supposed to do.
No, of course not.
It's
doesn't help.
A cash cow? Is that what it is?
Sure. Johnson & Johnson made more than $100 billion on that drug. And here's the thing, Tudor. Johnson & Johnson was the lead of making these what are known as atypical antipsychotics. There were 4 other companies that made them. Every single one of those companies pleaded guilty to charges that they were bribing psychiatrists and others to prescribe these drugs in inappropriate ways. So here's the thing. If you know a psychiatrist who's about 50 or older, they were participants in the largest, costliest, and deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history. That's not hyperbole. Like the number, I have this estimate, there are at least 1 million patients have died. Another epidemiologist estimated it's upwards of 6 million. So it's a huge amount of death. Again, like a huge share of the nation's psychiatrists were part of this crime because every single company involved in this situation pleaded guilty to bribing them. This is not just a small number of psychiatrists. The grand jury files show nearly everyone participated.
Stay tuned for more of my conversation with Gardiner Harris, but first, let me tell you about my partners at IFCJ. Israel is still under attack. Missile fire has resumed from the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, enemies seeking Israel's destruction. Here in America, we can't imagine living under the constant threat of terrorism and rocket attacks, but this is the reality in Israel. Parents are taking their children to school and then falling on the ground to lay on top of their small children, trying to comfort them as sirens blare. The next attack is happening against Israel right now. And with little time to prepare, we must act now. And that's why I'm partnering with the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews to help provide life-saving aid and security essentials. Your urgently needed gift today will help provide security essentials like bomb shelters, flak jackets, and bulletproof vests for first responders, armored security vehicles, ambulances, and more. Join me in standing with Israel. Call to make your gift at 888-488-IFCJ. That's 888-488-4325. Or go online at supportifcj.org to give. It's one word, supportifcj.org. Now stay tuned. We've got more right after this. I've told this story a couple of times. About maybe a year or 2 years ago, I met a man at a conference and he came up to me and he said, "Hey, I hear that you're in Michigan. I think you could help us out in Michigan. We're really trying to get into Michigan. We run a company that makes sure that patients who can't afford pharmaceuticals get them for free." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the pharmaceutical companies want to get them onto these meds, so they will give them to them for free." And I said, "Explain to me what you mean." "Well, they figure that if they can get one person on the family, their goal is to get every person on the family on a pharmaceutical. So if they can get one person, even if they can't afford it, eventually they'll get the payment for the drug. So once they get one person on a pharmaceutical, they can get the rest of the family on a pharmaceutical." And I was horrified. I said, "Is that really, you want to represent that?" "Well, I mean, this is helping to save lives." But now we're talking about little kids. They're getting little kids on medication that I read your book and I say, and that's what I say is the danger. I don't want to believe that everything is bad, and I know there are medications that are life-saving. I mean, my gosh, I've watched Outlander. I know that back then people just died of infection, it's like,
Right.
I know.
That's a great series. Yeah.
It is. But at the same time, I'm like, I don't want my kids on meds they don't need to be on. I don't want anybody's kids on meds they don't need to be on. I don't want any adults to be on meds they don't need to be on. And I have seen people that I love take medications that have had horrendous side effects, and I see no positive change in their health, but they cannot get off of these medications. Well, how do you fight this machine?
Yeah. I think one of the most shocking parts of these last 5 years to me was the number of times that Johnson & Johnson actually went after babies. This is a company that calls itself the baby company. One of the stories I tell, and it had real resonance for me. My own son, my firstborn, was in the NICU for 4 or 5 days after his birth in 2003. And shortly after that searing experience, which, I'm sure you know about, Tudor, I got these inside documents from Johnson & Johnson showing that it had been marketing this heartburn drug named Propulsid for use in babies. And in fact, they had created this cherry liquid flavored version of the drug. And they had undertaken 20 separate clinical trials to show that it was effective in babies in preventing spit up. every single one of those trials had failed. Like you shouldn't be able to do a third trial in babies if your first two failed. This is a protected class. The ethics of testing anything in infants and babies is fraught, and you must believe that this. You must have very good reason to believe that it's going to be effective for them to do it. They ended up doing 20 trials. All of them failed. They nonetheless underwrote this quiet marketing campaign for these to be used in the smallest of infants. They were so successful that 1 in 5 NICU infants were given Propulsid for these years. And not only was it not effective in them, but it caused what's called, it caused a basic arrhythmia, QT prolongation. So it killed baby after baby after baby after baby. And they knew this. The babies were piling up. The FDA was expressing more and more alarm. Why is this drug being given to babies? It's not approved for babies. We know it doesn't work. What's going on? And FDA didn't know that Johnson & Johnson was quietly underwriting a marketing campaign for its use in what they called happy spitters, which was healthy babies who had some spit up problems. Just give them Propulsid. And, I had just had my son in a NICU unit. I mean, if not for just luck and a little bit of a delay, that might have been my child. And so this is true, like in baby powder, of course. This is contaminated with asbestos. It's being put on babies' bottoms. And of course, moms themselves breathe it in. And there's example after example after example of this, of them going after babies.
I mean, we had a gentleman on who he was the one who did all of the research after the Columbine killings and after the girl who had convinced her boyfriend to commit suicide. And he had been gathering for school shootings. He had been gathering the medical data that he could. Some of it you can't get because they're under 18. And he said, I had gone to the FDA early on and said, for these medications that were used in ADHD and ADD and those for all these young people, they are causing suicidal and homicidal tendencies. You have to have that in the ads. And then you suddenly start seeing ads. It's like, if you're thinking of harming yourself or someone else, this could be because you're on this medication. Well,
right.
he contends that he believes that this increase in depression, he said, this isn't solving depression. These drugs aren't actually solving depression. So we're more depressed than we ever have been. And I read your book and I think, my gosh, what if we are causing some of these terrible disasters to happen because they alter how your brain thinks, how you communicate, and what your body thinks is the necessary thing to do because you're changing the chemicals in these people's bodies. And I read your book and I'm like, who can we trust? I mean, you make a statement. You say few companies in America have had a wider gap between their public reputation and their actual conduct than J&J. And I see that and I think, and you talk about the money and the advertising and the PR that they have behind them. There are so many more. How many more?
Right. Well, I covered all the companies. I think that each one of these companies is very different and has a very different character. I actually think that there are a couple of companies that I'm fond of and think that they are relatively well behaved. The problem is that there's this enormous gap, and there are companies that are really, really dark. Tudor, I mean, as you know, there's a lot of people who've sort of given up on the system. And there's many people in public health. I was the public health reporter who get very frustrated about this. That, right now there's a measles outbreak in Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And, they think the obvious answer is obviously more vaccination. And I think there's good data for backing up childhood vaccinations. The problem is that my friends in public health don't understand that it's very difficult to separate out the lies from the truth in a system in which an agency like FDA is so bought and paid for, frankly, and is so enabling bad behavior. So you get sort of public health endorsement for some products, and it's I think while other products, it's clear Johnson & Johnson in the case of EPO and cancer sat on the results of clinical trial after clinical trial after clinical trial showing that actually EPO is miracle grow to tumors. This was the most popular drug in cancer for about 15 years. If you have a loved one who died of cancer during the administrations of Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, there's about a 50% chance that they got EPO. And that means there's a very good chance that your loved one either died because of Johnson & Johnson or lost precious months of life because of them. And because they had done these studies that they didn't even give the data to the FDA to. And the FDA really did nothing about it. So that's why there's this loss of faith. The places, for instance, I point out in the book, EPO is still used by oncologists in small towns throughout the country. These are the places that have lost faith the most, right? That's not a coincidence.
Right. Well, and then you have the birth control that's not actually preventing you from getting pregnant, but it's just adding. I mean, and that, when I had breast cancer, that was shocking. How every doctor's office you walked into, how long were you on birth control? How long were you on birth control? That was the first question every time.
Right.
What birth control did you take? How long were you on it? And I'm like, they know what's happening to us. And it is crazy how many women have this.
The problem of, as you know, is estrogen, right? And as you know, after
and I had
cancer,
estrogen receptive cancer.
Right. And after, I'm sure you took estrogen blocking drugs after your cancer, right? And so birth control pills used to have very high levels of estrogen, and they gradually started notching down as doctors realized you would still get the birth control effect with much lower levels of estrogen. But what Johnson & Johnson did with its patch is launch a patch that had basically twice as much estrogen as the low-dose birth control pills on the market, and they lied to FDA about it. And so thousands upon thousands of women had strokes, had heart attacks, all who didn't need to have them, all because they didn't know that they were getting this huge dose of estrogen.
I mean, it's just shocking. So I want to go through, I've kept you a little bit long because I just can't. I mean, I'm just like, this is mind blowing, and I could talk about it for hours, but I do want to quickly touch on the COVID vaccine, because I think that I was watching that again as a woman. I mean, I feel like this is overwhelmingly shocking for women, but again, as a woman, I'm watching this. They're like, oh, this is actually causing these terrible blood clots in women. Maybe we'll back off of women taking it. But this is again already after in Europe, they're like, yeah, we're not going to have the J&J vaccine. We're not going to have I think AstraZeneca was like the same situation. They pulled it.
Right.
The FDA allows them leeway to fix it. They're like, work on it a little bit longer, knowing it's no good.
Right. The COVID vaccine story, this was a moment that J&J hoped would sort of revive its reputation. By the time COVID came about, many of these scandals that we're talking about, and just then FDA finally tested baby powder itself and announced, surprise, surprise, that they had found asbestos in baby powder, right? And it's a story I also tell about how they, even in that situation, they know that this lot of baby powder, they certainly know it has asbestos in it. They don't announce this immediately. They let Johnson & Johnson have 4 days to sort of figure out what their talking points are. So Johnson & Johnson knew that they were in trouble and saw the COVID-19 situation as a chance at redemption. Everyone is going to sort of ignore all the stuff that we had done before if we can save the planet. But of course, the project that they launch is the use of a cold virus as the kind of vehicle to transport the COVID-19 vaccine. And they know before going into it that there are all these problems using cold viruses as a vaccine transport because it causes, bizarrely, both clotting and bleeding at the same time. Usually things either cause clotting or they cause bleeding. But this, oddly enough, sort of does both. They nonetheless move forward with this program. They hire this outside manufacturing firm that has this disastrous history. And all the while, they're having these meetings. The CEO is going to the White House. President Biden is giving him the platform, praising him and his scientists as saving humanity.
And he's introducing the president. I mean, this is like,
yep.
Well, I mean, this guy is coming in with like bells and whistles and, a parade of elephants. It's just shocking to me.
All the while, he had made, this is the CEO, Alex Gorski, he had made their COVID-19 vaccine program the center of the largest PR campaign that Johnson & Johnson had launched in forever. They had, they had this podcast, they had videos, they had Sean Penn working for them. They had all kinds of PR going on about this. And they must have known when Alex was in the White House with President Biden that the whole thing was going to collapse, because FDA inspectors had already found that the facility where they were manufacturing this had become deeply, deeply contaminated, and that nearly most of the doses that they had promised to deliver in the following months were almost immediately deep sixed because they were contaminated. And yet they continued to get the PR benefit up until the last second.
And then they don't even cut it off, really. They end the program quietly in 2023.
Right.
I mean, that to me was the most shocking part. But you're hearing like little rumblings of there was some mold found at the facility. It might not be the cleanest facility. Maybe some doses were mixed together with a different brand, and these are contaminated, and you can't actually ship these out. And then it's like, oh, we're finding out that some women have died. Because the women have died, we're going to put a pause on it. But the pause doesn't even last very long. And they're like, oh, this is it's so hard to pause it because we've got to get it into all the college students. It's one shot. It's so much easier. We've got to do it. And there's this inherent trust in Johnson & Johnson, and the American public has this trust for Johnson & Johnson. And that to me was the pinnacle of all of this. I'm reading this book, and honestly, I will tell people, read this. I think you're right. Get it right away. It comes out next week, right? The 8th?
It does. Yeah. April 8th.
So it's called No More Tears: The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson. And we'll put it up there so people can see it. But I think you have to read this because it will change the way you view everything. I mean, even from, we didn't get into the breast implants and the implant illness, the breast implant illness.
There's so many others.
There's so many. And that shocked me because when I had reconstructive surgery, they were like, oh, we've got this new breast implant and it's this teardrop shape and it's kind of rough and it stays in place and you're going to really love it. And this is what they put inside of me. And a year later, I start reading that this causes lymphoma.
Right.
And nobody calls me and says, you've got this cancer. You just got over cancer. You've got a little device inside your body that's going to cause cancer again. Nobody calls me. I call Johns Hopkins and I say, hey, what do you know about this? And they said, yeah, anybody who's calling us to ask us about it, we're telling them to get them removed immediately. And I did. I went and immediately had them removed. But nobody called me to tell me you have something inside of you that will cause you to get cancer again. It's shocking to me.
It's a scandal that the medical device industry and regulators, FDA, has never required that there be medical device registries so that, we know what kind of medical devices people get, what health consequences they have subsequently. It's been sort of talked about. Other countries have these kind of registries, but but basically quietly, the industry has been opposing it forever. And, one of the real, as you know, Tudor, women have complained about the health consequences of breast implants for 30 and 40 years. And for all of that time, the industry denied that there was anything. The FDA asked the industry throughout this period of time, well, okay, we'll do a study, follow these women for 10 years. And the industry always promised, yep, we're going to do that, but sure. And then never did. And, oh, well, it was too hard. We couldn't. Okay, we're starting another study. Well, the results of that were never shown. Like, it just, we could have found this information out 20 years ago, and the industry just basically filibustered throughout that period of time because they didn't want to know.
Well,
and,
why would you want to track your mistakes?
Exactly. And, one of the things I talk about in the book is that the FDA is terrible at tracking how drugs and devices operate once they're approved. And I suggest in the book that we follow what we do in aircraft, right? We've got the FAA that approves aircrafts. And then when there's a crash, we get the NTSB in there that's independent, that doesn't have this conflict because they approved the airplane to start with. And I think that's the problem with FDA. FDA is, first of all, not only all of their jobs depend upon the industry and the payments the industry make for them, but also the medical officers are committed to these products that they approved, and they don't really want to hear that they're not working out as well as they thought or hoped. And so I think there needs to be actually a separate agency that tracks the safety of medical devices and drugs once they have been approved, that doesn't have this fundamental intellectual conflict of how they are invested in this product because they approved it.
I agree. I mean, do these drugs make people violent? Do these implants make people sick? Do these hips cause problems? I mean, all of these things. Do these drugs actually accelerate cancer? All of these things. And the crazy part about it, I'll just end on this. The crazy part about it is that you have to have a second agency to look at what is happening because the companies are hiding it. They actually know.
Right. In case after case after case, that is true, Tudor.
It is shocking. So get the book. Again, it's No More Tears, The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson. Gardiner Harris, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this today. It's been eye-opening, and I really hope that with Secretary Kennedy, things will change. All
right. Take care, Tudor. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Check out the podcast at the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time. Have a blessed day.